Hello, and welcome back to Sounding Cinema, where we explore how music and sound shape our relationship with film. I'm Nathan Platt, and I teach music and film history at the University of Iowa. In the first two episodes, Anastasia Scholze and I surveyed the sound world of Robert Wise's films and took a deep dive into his 1961 adaptation of West Side Story. Our third and fourth episodes take a new approach. Here, we explore and compare the 1964 French musical, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, with the 2020 Oscar winner, Sound of Metal. Two films that take the soundtrack in extreme directions to tell their stories. For these two episodes, I'm thrilled to welcome several more students from the University of Iowa who've been thinking about film music and sound in one of my classes from this past spring semester. I'll introduce them in just a moment. First, a quick introduction to Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Directed by Jacques Demy, the film begins in the midst of a love affair between a young car mechanic named Guy and a young woman named Geneviève, who works with her mother in an umbrella shop. When Guy gets drafted to serve in Algeria, the two part tearfully at the Cherbourg train station. But Guy doesn't do a very good job of keeping in touch with Geneviève, who learns she is pregnant and that her mother is on the cusp of financial ruin. Cassard, a wealthy jewelry dealer, assures Genevieve's mother that he'll take good care of Geneviève, who at first resists his attention, but eventually accepts his proposal. Guy wrestles with disillusionment after returning from his tour of duty, but ultimately achieves his career dream of owning his own gas station. And he marries Madeleine, the woman who cared for his ailing aunt. In the film's infamously bittersweet conclusion, Geneviève inadvertently visits Guy's gas station. They talk for a few minutes, mention their kids, and then Geneviève drives off. That's it. Oh, there's one more thing. All of the characters sing their lines. I emphasize the word characters because the actors are all dubbed by other singers, a subject we explored in our second episode on West Side Story. But Umbrellas of Cherbourg takes the musical in an unexpected direction by not ever allowing the characters to break from singing. Whether chatting about car repairs, or expressing heartbreak, or worrying about the bills, all of the lines are set to composer Michel Legrand's score, which inhabits various styles, including big band jazz, broad, Hollywood-esque symphonic scoring, and the popular French chanson.
Mon amour, oh mon amour,
Geneviève, ma petite Geneviève.
dis je t'aime. Tu sens l'essence.
The film lightly mocks its own approach. Early, Guy tells his friends he's taking Geneviève to see Carmen, an opera that, ironically, has some plot parallels with Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Guy's friend tells him that he prefers movies to operas. Why? Because operas have too much singing.
Ce soir c'est sacré, je vais au théâtre. Qu'est-ce que tu vas voir? Carmen. L'amour est enfant de bohème, la 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 la. J'aime pas l'opéra, le ciné c'est mieux.
To spend some time exploring this whimsical, emotional, and truly idiosyncratic film, I'm happy to welcome our guests.
Like, it's not realistic that they're going to sing the entire thing. But at the same time, it's a very realistic, natural narrative. That's
Rebekah Erdman, who's a musicology doctoral student at the University of Iowa.
I really wanted to talk about the organ sounds. I don't know if people are interested in that.
And that's Cecilia Kryzda, a graduate student in the Communication Studies department who's interested in visual manifestations of sound in pop culture.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like they're singing songs at all. It just feels like they're singing exactly what they would be saying.
Anastasia Scholze is already a familiar voice to this podcast, and she's just graduated as a voice major at Iowa.
It's kind of exhausting. It's a ride. It's a fun ride. It's a ride you should absolutely take. But you're going to want to sit down and take a rest for a little bit after you finish.
And Noah Zahradnik is a cinematic arts and journalism major who, like Anastasia, graduated with his bachelor's degree this spring. So let's start with Umbrellas of Cherbourg's standout feature, the non-stop singing. We know that director Demy was excited about this approach because it meant he didn't need to worry about transitioning from spoken dialogue to songs, which is what happens in most film musicals. What are some of the consequences of this method? Rebekah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the through singing really accomplishes the seamlessness that Demy wanted, because even the distance scenes, that narratively are very distant, between an auto shop and the opera, they still feel connected via the use of constant music. However, we do lose the sense of numbers. And in some ways, we lose a sense of realism because, we don't go around our lives singing all the time. We also sort of lose connection with the characters. It's harder to relate to them emotionally, and we don't identify with them as much because we're not inside their heads.
So you think by having them sing, it's harder to identify with sort of their emotional state?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if it's necessarily only emotional, right? But through sporadic use of music, through non-diegetic score or through singing in typical musicals, it seems as though like the viewer is drawn into this character. They sort of view them as like, oh, this is the hero, this is the protagonist, like we identify with them, we want them to succeed. And I think part of that, like jumping ahead to think how this fits into the whole film, the use of the throat sound and the throat music ties into the fact that we don't have a hero at the end. It's open, it's ambiguous, and the throat music sort of prepares us for that.
The seamlessness, it's also like a continuous stream of song. And so it's hard to, as you just said, it's hard to grab onto. Like it's just a continuing train. Like that's the way I'm thinking about this movie, because the train figures so importantly, because it's the train that takes Guy to, Algeria. But it's a continuous train. It sounds like the music will never stop because the train also keeps going. But I also thought is on second viewing or reviewing, I was listening to the soundtrack last night, and I noticed that consistently the music is mixed lower overall. And the voices are always sort of at the forefront for obvious reasons, so we can understand. And also the language in this film is easy. The French is quite easy. It's not tricky or poetic in the way that, if you have any, experience reading poetry in any language, and the way that makes its way into song, it becomes impenetrable sometimes. So this is a great movie to watch if you're a beginning French learner, and because the language is simple and it's so well articulated and it's so easy to understand.
Peut-être avez-vous besoin de repos.
En effet, Geneviève s'est beaucoup surmenée. Cet an dernier, elle est un peu palote.
And it's mixed so close to your ear. So also at the same time, just on an emotionally resonant level, because the instrumental orchestral parts are mixed lower, just overall, I think there's only a few times that I feel like it's surging a little bit, and there's gaps. There's very few dramatic, huge gaps. There's maybe, I would say, a few seconds worth in the whole film where there's kind of like an orchestral swell, but it's not the same intensity as like a Hollywood, like I'm thinking of like Hollywood 50s, like just like melodramas. It's like, there's like that close up on the actress, and she doesn't even speak anymore. The music takes a hold and words cannot express. I think that this film is much more interested in how people are also speaking about their feelings as the music accompanies them.
I like that point that music is this sort of alternative space, right, where we go for special emotive purposes. But if the music is on the entire time, then how does that change the game? And I think your point about the mixing is one of the ways in which it changes. Like the instrumental accompaniment actually does have to be kind of kept further in the background so that we are able to hear the song as both song but also script, and as quote unquote sort of normal, even though obviously it's not. It's normalized within the film.
Cecilia, I like what you said about the language of of the movie. And then Dr. Platt, you said something about like using music for emotive expression. And I think both of those things for this movie are really interesting. In some spaces, it's described as like it's in an opera form because it's sung throughout the whole thing, or it could be seen as like a sung throughout musical, but it just feels completely different from a musical film or a staged opera or a musical. And part of it like maybe feels because of the language. Like if you're singing songs in an opera, especially, or even in a musical, it feels sometimes like there's something behind it poetically, or the libretto or the lyrics are written in a way it's probably not just a conversation, or if it's a conversation, it's quirky or deep.
Tu déraisonnes, n'est-ce pas, Madeleine?
Bien sûr, elle va déjà mieux.
Like it's almost just dialogue in a movie.
Le régiment n'est pas la guerre. Avant de partir, je veux que tu saches que tout ce que
as the dialogue does feel different from like that background orchestral score. Like they're different, but how do you differentiate between the two, and like what is dialogue, how is it a movie, how is it a musical? It's really interesting what space that's in, and how you do connect to those characters.
Au revoir, Madeleine.
Au revoir, Guy.
There really does sort of seem to be a kind of sense, almost like Michel Legrand had a musical idea and said, okay, like we've got this, now how do we fit the script sort of around it? And that kind of creates that effect, I think, that you're talking about, Anastasia, where it's sort of like, well, yeah, I mean, this music the instrumental music feels, approximately appropriate to what's going on, but it doesn't feel like this is like kind of internally motivated by the character's, immediate state. They're kind of singing along to this thing that's happening kind of in the background, which is an interesting and unusual sort of expressive space to be in if we're thinking of film musicals or even opera.
Yeah, I made a note in my while I was watching that it felt like they were just singing along to an instrumental piece. It feels like there are these moments where they're trying to do something a little bit new when they're singing. So they don't always sing on the exact same beats. So it feels a little bit more natural. So there'll be like a pause and then they will syncopate or kind of flutter back to the end of the phrase while pausing for a second. So it feels like a little bit more natural.
Une heure, si maman ne dort pas, oh là, qu'est-ce que je vais entendre? Je devrais me maquiller, tu ne trouves pas?
Non, tu es très jolie comme ça.
Un peu ici,
Où ça?
là. Nous vendrons des parapluies.
Yeah, I think like Cecilia, your idea of naturalness, and I've been interpreting it as like sort of realism, and that's the idea I keep coming back to, because I mean, I said earlier, like it's not realistic that they're going to sing the entire thing, but at the same time, it's a very realistic, natural narrative, right? I mean, it's this plot that follows what sort of would happen in real life, right? I mean, we don't have all of these wonderful love stories, and it's not a full-out tragedy where they both die. It's just they go on with real life, and that's very natural. So I think that element is what I keep coming back to and thinking about, like, despite the fact that the music makes it feel a little bit odd, the music is pointing towards like, but we're doing something different with the narrative here too.
Yeah, and going off of what you said about naturalness, like songs in musicals almost feel unnatural, because when we listen or watch those, we're like, oh, you don't just stop in the middle of talking to someone and sing a song about your feelings. And yeah, singing all of the things that you think in your like day-to-day life is also unnatural, but at least it's consistent. It's just how they speak in the movie. So maybe that like goes along with how things are set up naturally or realistically in a different way.
I'm really fascinated by this discussion of naturalness and how the film kind of diverges from our real life in that way, and very much from like established musical or even opera films or productions in general. That's honestly what attracts me to Umbrellas so much, and the idea of this heightened fantasy where everybody can sing, everybody sings, and it's this seamless sort of inclusion of music into our lives. It very much, I think, heightens the fantasy of what musicals do for us in the first place, and the idea that everybody is kind of on the same wavelength, and that at any moment in time, a musical number could erupt at any moment. And it Umbrellas in that sense, I think, heightens that fantasy. Will say, well, why is it just limited to musical numbers? If we're all in this fantasy together, we can all sing at all points in time. And for that point, yes, there is very limited area for emotional expression in line delivery from the actors. But a lot of that establishing the emotion of the scene, and very specifically the connections and relationships between characters, is all done by the score and the music that's mixed in. I almost see Umbrellas as kind of an answer to studio era musicals of the 50s, where again, it's just taking this idea, this fantasy of music being integrated into our lives. It's almost like, have you seen those videos online where it's like the rhythms of comedy, and it's a guy behind a drum set and he's going along to like the beat of a John Mulaney skit?
Sometimes when people order fries, they act like it's a little adventure. They'll be like, should we get a plate of fries for the table? Should we do it? Should we share some fries?
That's what it feels like to me. That's what Umbrellas feels like to me. It's dialing in on the natural rhythms and tendencies of our daily lives and our conversations, and elevating that to the fantasy level of a studio era musical. And that's what I think is so engaging about it. But like we've all mentioned here before, the cost of that is just the seamlessness. It is non-stop. And by the end of it, it's like a 90-minute movie, but by the end of it, not only are you listening to music and lyrics the whole movie, but this is a foreign film, so unless you speak French, you're going to be reading a lot of subtitles. It's kind of exhausting. It's a ride. It's a fun ride. It's a ride you should absolutely take. But you're going to want to sit down and take a rest for a little bit after you finish. That is by no means a bad thing, but it is kind of one of the things that's lost by having them talk or sing instead of talk, and take slow moments and take breathers.
Noah, I'm so glad you brought up those videos. I was watching every single one of those on YouTube. There's an ad called Big Joe's Truck Repair, and he has just a very musical voice. And so this person, who's I think a jazz guitarist or something, sets music to it and plays along with it with the guitar. And it's really amazing. Like, you realize that. Or there's one of Cardi B. Anyway.
A lot of you children, you know what? I've been realizing that like a lot of kids, they really love me and they be looking up to me, and like, you know, when I be seeing them, they just be like, Cardi, I love you, I'm your biggest fan. And you know what? Because of the kids, I have to realize I do have to change. I have to change in the cursing, certain type of things I do. I gotta keep them in mind, you know, because they love me.
And you realize how dependent you are as a viewer in that perfect, like the oatmeal that's not too hot or too warm or too cold, of like right in the middle, where it's like there's enough space but there's always that music that helps us sort of like communicate some kind of emotional field that we're used to accessing when we watch a movie. So then it's so weird to watch a movie like this, where it's like, nope, it's all the way. We're just going to turn up the volume, keep it on, no pauses, no breaks. And also what you were saying, Noah, about this, like thinking about this movie, situating this movie in its time. And I was noticing the sound of this like Latin jazz influence reminded me of West Side Story.
Ciao les gars, ciao, à demain.
If feels really new. It feels experimental in a sense. But at the same time, what's so fun about it is that it's actually accessing an older vocabulary of recitative style or the opera. So it's like, it feels really new, but it's just because the Hollywood framework is so rigid. Accessing any other form of storytelling feels really modern, but in a sense, it's so fun because Demy has like brought something older into a new context.
One of the things that's experiments are incredibly helpful for is illuminating conventions. And part of what defines Hollywood film musicals is that they don't sing all the time. And so what happens if we change that? Demy has this script. He sits down with Michel Legrand, and as I understand it, they did make adjustments in order to make certain lines easier to sing within a certain amount of space. But there was this idea of, we are not, in a normal musical, it would sort of be like you'd have the songwriting team and we'd say, okay, and they go into a song here, so, you go and write a song for this sequence, and they go and write a song, and they bring it back and they drop it in. Here, there's this sort of sense of like, well, these are the words we're working with, so now figure out how to fit it into the music. And so, yeah, it creates a really different effect.
Quelle heure est-il? 6h15. Comment se fait-il qu'il ne soit pas encore venu? C'est peut-être un escroc. Il t'aura fait marcher. Tu divagues, mais qu'est-ce que tu as?
Now's a good time to emphasize that Umbrellas of Cherbourg, unlike so many other musicals, is not about the central couple falling in love. Instead, Geneviève and Guy are already in love when the film begins, and over the course of the film, they end up marrying others. In this way, Umbrellas raises the almost existential question of what can a film be about if the couple is already together at the very beginning? Noah got me thinking about this special quality when he shared with me a podcast he had made about the film The Money Pit, which he'll mention later. For now, we're going to listen to the sequence leading up to and including Geneviève's wedding to Cassard. Directly before our excerpt commences, we see Cassard ask permission from Geneviève's mother to marry. This isn't just good manners, it's a way of limiting his scenes with his bride-to-be. Cassard actually spends more of the film talking to her mother than to her. And this highlights the marriage's transactional stakes. Geneviève's mother needs money, and Geneviève is pregnant and single. Marrying Cassard ostensibly fixes these problems. But there's no singing for the wedding. Instead, we watch Geneviève's mother walking down the aisle of a dress shop, past mannequins wearing wedding dresses, until she arrives at her own daughter, posed like another mannequin wearing a wedding veil. From there, we get a hard visual and audio cut to the church and the wedding itself. Orchestra is replaced with organ, although the organ is playing related musical material. This texture, incidentally, is associated with Genevieve's mother. When the married couple emerges from the church, the organ sound transforms. Bride, groom, and bride's mother get in the car and drive away.
I have thoughts, but I am also curious as to, like, on a human level, did you get goosebumps like I did? Because this is like so, I shivered just again, even re-listening to it, knowing that it's going to happen. But it's such a rare, unusual moment in this movie that's so grounded in that kind of like a studio jazz feeling, intimate. This is one of the few moments in the film even when we're like seeing them from afar, like they're small and this church is immense, you know, and marriage. This is her entrance into the adult world. It's like this official like deliverance into something, and it's scary and it sounds scary, and it's such a beautiful organ piece. It's so beautiful, and it's seamless almost with the, as you know, the transition from the jazz to the organ is seamless, and it's using the same theme, and somehow it fits so well. It's like an illusion. Like this, I could imagine this playing at a church after the service is over. But it's like a bearing down sound, and it's so contrasting with the rest of the film.
The podcast episode that Nathan was referencing, I talked about the Tom Hanks romantic comedy called The Money Pit. And I make the argument that it's a very unique film because it doesn't show a couple meeting and falling in love. It's about a couple very a ways away into their relationship. And it's about them trying to stay together through the hardships, which is, I think, is a very unique topic to see in film. And again, it does draw parallels to Umbrellas and the idea of having to stay in love. But what I think this scene in particular, the organ scene, the wedding scene, like Cecilia said, like it's got weight to it. It's a little bit overbearing. When I hear organ music in the traditional sense, I do think of something that's a little bit more macabre. Usually elicited because of like the classic Universal monster films and stuff. So to me, the organ, it feels ominous. It feels like there's some kind of impending threat, or there's just something off. And in that sense, it elicits questions in my mind of, is this really the right thing to do? You know, are our characters making the correct decisions based on the way that they feel, or are they making decisions based on what they're being told to do? And from there, in my mind, I kind of make the connection to something like Great Gatsby. I love Gatsby because it to me, obviously, yes, it's the story of the American dream. We all took high school English. But to me, what I think is more fascinating about Gatsby is the question of love and monogamy, and whether or not Daisy actually truly loved Gatsby, even after she's been married. And does she stay with Buchanan because she has an obligation to, or because she loves him? Is it possible that she loves both men? And I feel very much in the same sense here. It begs the question of, you know, love between strictly two people. It begs the question of the ending scene. You know, is Guy has moved on, but is Genevieve moved on? You know, is she's like, well, I came back and I didn't expect to run into you here. Does she stay with the life that she's chosen out of obligation? I have a child. I've made a commitment, you know, in this institution under the guise of the Lord. Do I stay out of obligation, or do I stay out of love? Is it both? Is it none? And I think this particular scene and the organ specifically is the first moment in the film that kind of plants that seed of doubt and question because of the ominous and sort of the baggage that the idea of an organ carries, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, you know, just all the ideas you just brought up, because I struggle like separating the opera Carmen from this film, right? Because there are the parallels, and it seems like this organ scene, I mean, like Cecilia said, it's almost shocking because it's so different than everything around it. But it's really like, that's the point of divergence from the Carmen story, right? You know, Carmen does go off with the bullfighter, but they don't get married. Like, she just flits around. You know, so I think like this is also the point where the plots diverge. And it does sort of make us question, you know, like who is the victim? Is it him because, you know, she left him? Is it her because, you know, he had to go off to war? You know, what is right? Do we have this quest for love and freedom, or do we, you know, as humans, do we just sort of tamper down our passion and live by reason? And, you know, that's again in Carmen, you know, the opera, but it's also so prominent in this musical, especially at this point, as Noah was pointing out, like, this is ominous. What's going to happen?
Yeah. I think the phrase that I'd written down when I was watching it was "seal the deal." It's like it's like question again with this sort of knowing new wave influence of this film. it's cynical and or skeptical about marriage and love and the relationship between those things, right? Unlike these Hollywood classics where marriage is the expression and the end point of romance. In this case, these are separate entities, and the marriage seems like a series of, official actions.
Toi, tu vas bien?
Oui, très bien.
Now, the finale of Umbrellas of Cherbourg is just as striking, but for somewhat different reasons. Several years have passed, and Guy and his wife Madeleine have a young child. It's around Christmas, it's snowing, and Guy is at his gas station. A black car pulls in. It's Geneviève and her child. Geneviève brings Guy up to date. It's her first time back in Cherbourg since her wedding, and her mother recently passed away. And her daughter reminds her of Guy. Then Geneviève drives away, the camera pulls back on the gas station, and we see, through a long shot that pulls further away, Guy greeting his wife and child in the snow. Throughout this entire exchange, the same theme that we heard at the beginning of the film under the main titles repeats and repeats, modulating upward by a half step multiple times. There's a stunning effect that as the music becomes higher, louder, and bigger, Legrand brings in a full chorus of singers, the scene takes on epic proportions, even though the camera is showing us a very ordinary gas station on a snowy night. Visuals and music seem to be sending two very different messages, so it is up to us to decide what to make of these conflicting sentiments.
Maybe don't put this in the podcast, but my first reaction was like, oh my goodness, is this theme ever going to end? Like, I don't want to hear it again, because it just keeps repeating and it doesn't go anywhere, right? I mean, we sort of expect musically like, oh, we're going to get a secondary theme or we're going to get some sort of closure, and we never do. But I think, again, that ambiguity is sort of tied into the whole narrative, right? This is what I mean when I say it's more realistic, because it is in real life, like nothing is completely good and nothing is completely bad. And, we're not always happy and we're not always in the pits of despair. And so this scene to me, especially with this sort of nostalgic, bittersweet melody, it is really sort of that point where we're like, oh, like, yes, it's, there's this constant music, but this does seem realistic. It does seem natural. I mean, that's at least what my brain is thinking of.
Mm-hmm. Natural meaning that they go their separate ways, and he doesn't seem especially broken up by that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a narrative that like could almost happen in real life,
Mm-hmm.
beyond some extraneous things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can reiterate the kind of this theme of like how to end this story. There's no logic for why the music would end because it's just always happening. So like, how do you finish? Like, they just go quiet. Well, that would be macabre. I feel like that would be scary.
Right. They just have to modulate themselves into oblivion.
Add a chorus.
Oh, that's so good. I guess the theme then is altered by different instrumentation. So the faraway horns and the, which we've never heard such a faraway sound. It's always sort of in the middle, there's a faraway horn sound, and then there's more of an emphasis on the low notes in the love theme, I sense. And then also there's a lot of empty space when they're singing, and it's breathy. And also there's a section with only this, the high strings and the horns, which are the unusual emphases. So anyway, it's like the extremes of the spectrum now, which allows for this more spaciness, and there's a lot more space now. So they're trying to, again, in the camera, as I noticed, the camera's zooming out, and the instrumentation is like wider apart. So there's like a widening, and then we zoom out, and then there's the harp and the choir, which are these classic tropes, of ending a film. So in this sense, I feel like this section makes it fit really cozily with a lot of other contemporaneous films.
That's a fascinating perspective. Like Rebekah mentioned, like it's very repetitive. This whole ending section is largely just one motif repeated over and over again. To me, the way that I feel about that is yes, it's very much an unconventional ending for a musical of this era, to not have these two characters who we have established are in love for the majority of the film not end up together. That's very contrary to genre trope. But the repetitiveness of the music and sort of the crane shot pulling back, revealing the larger picture as they go their separate ways, to me the repetitiveness is almost kind of hopeful, because it implies that love will go on no matter what happens. Love is a constant almost, and that you just kind of have to roll with the punches. And even though these two people are going these separate ways, which is how we start to have this distance, or this almost audible dissonance between the instruments and the space in which it's recorded, it's still repeating, it's still continuing. And as we pull back and as we kind of return, like Cecilia said, to our seats as an audience member, I think it's a little bit hopeful. Both of these characters had to make decisions that were difficult for themselves. They had to move on. They had to move on past this love, this relationship, this anchor that they'd established, that they've had for the majority of the film, and just kind of let that go. And that very much, I think, leads into Sound of Metal perfectly, just absolutely perfectly. But I think the repetitiveness is a very hopeful sound. So yeah, I love the ending sequence. I think probably that entire sequence in the snow, not just because it's in the snow, because I do love cinematic snow. I think that whole ending sequence is probably my favorite part. It's sad. It's disappointing that these two people who had built a life together don't get to spend the rest of it together. But there is an element of hope to it, and I like it quite a bit.
As our conversation has shown, Jacques Demy's Umbrellas of Cherbourg is very much in dialogue with the films of its era, including West Side Story. Guy and Geneviève even briefly dance to a mambo in a dance hall painted red, a clear shout-out to West Side Story's mambo in a similarly red-hued location. And this wasn't Demy's last stint of playfully tweaking the Hollywood musical. He would cast George Chakiris, who plays Bernardo in West Side Story, and Gene Kelly, the star of many MGM musicals, in his 1967 film The Young Girls of Rochefort, a film where characters are either dancing or are about to dance. And Demy's approach would in turn influence later directors, including Damien Chazelle in La La Land and Wes Anderson, whose fastidious visual compositions have a lot in common with Demy's. Now, in case you were thinking this podcast was only ever going to talk about 1960s musicals, we're breaking that mold in our next episode. Darius Marder's 2020 film, Sound of Metal, was nominated for 6 Oscars and won for Best Sound and Best Film Editing. We're very excited to share that part of our conversation with you in episode 4. In this episode, we heard brief clips from The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which you can watch on various streaming services and via a fantastic Criterion edition of the film on DVD and Blu-ray. Other clips in the episode include the performer Mono Neon accompanying Cardi B and Josh Harmon accompanying John Mulaney on Rhythms of Comedy Episode 3. To illustrate the concept of opera recitative, we heard a brief passage from the Chandos 2001 recording of Mozart's Don Giovanni, sung in English with David Perry conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra. This episode featured University of Iowa students Rebekah Erdman, Cecilia Kryzda, Anastasia Scholze, and Noah Zahradnik. I am so grateful to them for making the effort to record this episode at a really busy time of year. You can learn more about the podcast and contact us at soundingcinema.com and by following us on Instagram at soundingcinema or Facebook. If you're enjoying listening, help others find us by subscribing and rating the show on iTunes or Apple Podcasts.